Hello, and welcome back to our live stream. This is our 6th live stream, and if you don't know it already, I'm a bit of a science fiction geek, and today's episode is named after the character number 6 from Battlestar Galactica. This has all happened before. Okay, welcome back, and a little bit of housekeeping first before we sort of get started here. I noticed that the live chats have started getting vigorous, and we are going to need to set some parameters for how questions are asked. Like every other live stream, we're going to the super chats will take priority. But if you're not doing a super chat and you want to ask me personally a question as opposed to someone in the chat, put a Q and a colon in front of the question so I know it's a question directed to me. Also, I would ask that try not to repeat the questions so that I can just scan and see which questions have been are available for me to answer. So I would ask you at this point to not repeat the questions. I am going to still try to take the opportunity to answer non-super chat questions as well. However, I have to sort of know which ones are out there and available. So with that said, let's get started. Okay. Now, we do have a super chat that had been done way in advance, and I'll place that up here. Now, the thing with super chats done long in advance of the actual live stream is they do actually tend to fall off the live stream. YouTube times out super chats. So if it helps if I actually know that super chat is there. We have a super chat here from RG Strategy for $10. Thank you very much. Did the Sea Peoples attacks on Egypt and Merneptah and Ramses III contribute to the end of the New Kingdom and in the early mid 11th century BC? Okay, now we're not sure if the Sea Peoples attacked Merneptah. We do know that his attack was from the Libyans. As far as Ramses III, definitely. The Sea Peoples attacks did definitely to decline and ultimately to losing Egyptian hegemony in the Levant, but they were also losing it also in Kush at the same time. So it definitely contributed, but there seems to be more going on there economically and politically. And this was a long process. It was a process that happened over centuries. So really, at the beginning of, say, Merneptah's reign, we started to see this decline. So, again, we can't just pin it to one date. That collapse at, say, 1184 was sort of the climax of the collapse, but it had been going on for a long time before. Already during the reign of Merneptah, the Hittite emperor had sent a request for food because of a famine that was happening in Anatolia. So we're already seeing during Merneptah's reign the signs that things were starting to go south in the Levant and in Anatolia. So absolutely, it does hit Egypt a little later than, say, in Anatolia. It hits Anatolia and the Levant first, but the collapse does then move down into Egypt. So we do see this, and it is something that that does ultimately lead to the collapse of the Egyptian New Kingdom. Anyway, RG Strategy, thank you very much for your super chat. And we now will move on. Here, this. Okay, and hopefully this will load all those super chats. We have got just a super chat from Matthew Harnell for $4.99. Thank you very much. Plus, he had 2 additional super chats with questions right after it. So we'll get right to those. Is there any correlation between the opening of mouth in the Book of the Dead and the purifying of Isaiah's mouth in the Bible? I wouldn't say it's the opening of the mouth in the Book of the Dead. There isn't, say, a correlation there between the Book of the Dead and the Isaiah's purifying of the mouth. However, there is a connection between the purification of Isaiah's mouth and the purification of the mouth in Egyptian priestly purification ritual. Because in Egyptian priestly purification ritual, they would shave their heads, they would ritually bathe, and they would put on new linens and new shoes. Okay, and that was, but the Egyptian priests would also wash their mouth out with natron. They basically put some natron in the mouth, swirl it around, and spit it out to purify their mouth. I think there is some connection between that priestly act of purifying the mouth in Egyptian ritual and the purifying of the mouth of Isaiah, because the idea even in the Egyptian ritual is that they're purifying their tongue of bad words. You know, people, there's this inherent understanding that people have unclean lips and an unclean tongue. So that's the idea in Egyptian ritual. So I think the same sort of cognate applies to Isaiah's mouth cleaning, as it were, cleansing of the mouth. Interestingly enough, we don't find this in normal priestly ritual in Israelite literature. So this seems to be something that's unique to Isaiah. But it's very interesting, and it's a very interesting connection. And thank you very much for that super chat. Very much appreciated. And now we'll take the next one, which is, again, from Matthew Harnell. Again, thank you for the third super chat in a row. Is there any correlation between snakes with legs, snakes with human legs in some papyri, and the curse of the snake in Genesis? What are some good beginner books? Okay, wow. You actually, if you ever go to Egypt and you go into tombs, you will see a lot of these motifs of these long snakes with legs. And it's really freaky to see. It's really neat. I can't stress that enough, how neat it is to see those, because you do see them. Now, we do see that snake in Genesis, and it's a symbolic serpent. It isn't actually supposed to be a literal snake. It is a angelic being that is analogized as a snake. So it's very clear that what we are seeing, say, in Genesis is more of a you're meant to get the sense that this is a demonic, or at least a demonic presence in potential. Okay, even though the fall has not happened, that's what's sort of lining up there. You're meant to say this is something that is meant to be, hey, there's something not right going on here. Okay, so and likewise, when you see these snakes with legs in tombs in Egypt, they're demonic manifestations. They're both, in a sense, meant to be the idealization or the analogization of demonic spiritual presences. So there is, in both cases, there's a sort of a symmetry, at least in symbolism. Now, what are good books on this? Beginner books? I'm not sure. I think for this sort of thing, I would probably recommend Wilkinson's Gods and Goddesses of Ancient Egypt. I don't know if there's been a lot published on the biblical side of this question. I haven't done a lot of reading in that end yet for my own study on this. But I think there's some. I would be very surprised if there wasn't some good literature out there on this. You know, maybe on biblical symbolism or on something on the Garden of Eden might have something on this. So there's almost surely a good beginner book for the biblical side, but I'm not aware of what that literature is. But thank you very much for your $4.99 super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, another super chat from Jonathan Billings. Thank you very much, $4.99. Good to see you here again. Jonathan is one of our regulars. I really appreciate you joining us. Okay, when does the Merneptah Stele date? Does it fit well with the late date of the Exodus and Joshua's conquest? The date of the Merneptah Stele is approximately 1218 BC. And it's a very, very good fit with the late date of the Exodus. The reason why it's a very good fit is because of what the Merneptah Stele describes. Now, I'm going to be doing a whole video on the Merneptah Stele, because it is probably one of the most important pieces of evidence we have for the early Israelite presence in Canaan, for the Exodus in general. But what I'm gonna say here is that the Merneptah Stele, what we're talking about when we talk about the Merneptah Stele, the most important bit that people like really fixate on is, they say, the presence of Israel in the text. Now, the text is really talking about the Libyan invasion and Merneptah's successful routing of the Libyans. But at the end, you get this poetic section, which sort of alludes to some of Merneptah's previous conquests. And those achievements are arranged in couplets. Now, the way couplets work in, say, ancient Near Eastern poetry, and you find this in Hebrew poetry too, like the Psalms and the Proverbs, you have some sort of comparison between the first half of the couplet and the second half. With the Merneptah Stele, there's a couplet here between Israel and the Hurrians. And this is really, really fascinating, because what you have with the Hurrians is they're essentially the remnant of the Mitanni Empire. The Mitanni Empire is defunct at this point. You still have some people from the Mitanni Empire living in Canaan. And they're living as sort of wandering tribal groups. They're sojourners. Well, the Israelites are also sojourners. So the Merneptah Stele has sort of coupled these two ethnicities together. Neither the Hurrians nor the Israelites are identified as being place names. They're ethnonyms, names that designate an ethnicity. And this is really, really interesting for one reason. Because we're told in the scriptures that that the Israelites were supposed to drive out the Hurrians, they were supposed to drive out the Hittites, the Amorites, all these various ethnicities. And yet what we see in, say, in the Merneptah Stele is this period. It's a snapshot. It gives us a snapshot of a time when the Israelites have just gotten their foothold in Canaan, but have not yet driven out the Hurrians. This is really, really interesting, because if we look at, say, the biblical text of Joshua, we see that it takes the Israelites time to drive out the other peoples. So if this was a late Exodus date, then what we would expect with the Merneptah Stele is Israel with other tribal groups in Canaan. And that's what we see in the Merneptah Stele. Whereas, if this was evidence, say, for an early Exodus date, we would already find the Hurrians gone. They'd already had been driven out. They would have already been long established in the land. And that's not what we're seeing here. We're seeing in the Judean foothills, Israel and the Hurrians sort of fighting it out, one driving out the other. So yes, I think this is really, really good evidence for a late date and for a Joshua conquest. So thank you very much for your question, and thank you for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay. We have got a super chat from King in the North. Thank you very much. $10. Very much appreciated. What do you think is the greatest evidence supporting the historical accuracy of the Old Testament? What is the best evidence against the historical accuracy of the Bible? Ooh, well, those are tough questions. I mean, it's no secret I'm a biblical maximalist. I mean, I think I see a lot of really good evidence for the historicity of the Old Testament. You got the Tel Dan Stele that mentions the House of David. You've got the Moabite Stele that mentions the House of Omri. You know, these were two dynastic houses in the kingdom period of Israel. We're just getting more and more data coming down the pipe every day. So there's just so much out there. I mean, in the case of the Tel Dan Stele, what makes that one so compelling too is that was found in situ. So it was actually found on an archaeological dig. So that's really, really interesting. So what we have is a variety of evidences. I mean, you got the Hezekiah seal. I mean, there's so much. There's just so much evidence that we can actually sort of look upon and say, okay, we should probably consider these sources as being at least having a modicum of accuracy. Now, what is the best evidence against the historical accuracy of the Bible? I don't know. I don't know if there's a lot of good evidence against it. Because when I do see, say, supposedly evidence against the Bible, I have to sort of say, well, is it against the Bible? Or is it against our interpretation of the Bible? 9 times out of 10, if there's evidence against the Bible, it's probably our interpretation of the texts. The other maybe 1/9 is maybe a text critical issue, or we just don't know. So again, very, very difficult. I mean, probably the most, say, compelling evidence I would say against maybe the numbers in the Israelite census, you know. But then again, too, we also know that ancient writers had numbers that appear to us to be inflated. We know this is what ancient writers did. And we know they did it all the way into Greek times. So this is not uncommon. So, you can't even really take that as negative evidence, because it's a stylistic, or it's a some sort of way of using numbers that we just don't know how it's done yet. You know, like, for example, they used to say that the Book of Kings was the greatest evidence against the Bible because the chronology of the House of Judah didn't line up with the chronology of the House of Israel. Well, you know, that was sort of the ongoing sort of thing for 100 years, and then Edwin Thiele, you know, sort of discovered the missing context to the Book of Kings and sort of figured it all out. And now we pretty much accept that it makes sense, because the underlying presuppositions that are not mentioned in the Bible have now been discovered. So that has now affected our interpretation of the scriptures. So it's a really difficult thing to talk about, you know, what's the best evidence against, because, you know, again, works out to what is our interpretation. But anyway, I want to thank you for that super chat. Thank you for the $10. Really very much appreciated. Okay, let's see what's next here. Okay, we've gotten through super chats. Let's see here. I'm gonna see about a question here. Again, I want to emphasize one thing. If you put in your sort of chats too early, again, YouTube will drop them off. So this is just something that YouTube does. Very, very old. It's like, say, I think something like 3 hours, or it has some 2-hour limit. There's some clock limit that YouTube has where it just starts dropping off chats. So at that point, I don't see them anymore. So let's see. Do I have a question here? question. There is a question here, a non-super chat from Sumatos Patui. I hope I got that right. What is the gilded snake found in the Egyptian shrine at Timna? Is it useful for interpreting the Old Testament pericope of the bronze serpent? Yes, it is. Essentially, the bronze serpent found at Timna is a kind of Uraeus, which is it's a kind of Egyptian serpent god. You see these all over the place in Egyptian mythology. You see them put on as decoration on the tops of tombs. You see them on the tops of shrines. You see them on the throne of King Tut. And what these serpent gods represent was a kind of holiness. What they did was the serpent god, the Uraeus in ancient Near Eastern myth, is what it did was it spit out fire. And this is analogous to the idea of the cobra spitting venom that burns if it gets into your eyes. So it was believed that these serpent gods could spit out fire. And they spit out fire to purify. Essentially, anything behind the serpent was protected, and anything that tried to pass the serpent got burned by the fire. So this is why you see rows of them on, say, shrines. And they're all facing outward. So the contents of the shrine was protected by the serpent god. So they would spit this fire out, and they would purify and keep whatever is inside clean. But they could also be worshipped as their own individual deity, and that's, say, what we find at Timna. Now, in the case of the Old Testament pericope, it's the Israelites sinned, and they were sort of struck by snakes and their venom. So Moses made this Uraeus. Essentially, it wasn't to be a god. It was meant to be the symbol of purity that the people would look up to and be made whole. So that's the idea that this is an angelic symbol, of purity that the Israelites would then look up to and be made whole. So that's the idea behind the whole Testament pericope. Now, ultimately, the bronze serpent was brought into the land of Canaan, where it did become an idol. But that was not the intent of it. The fact is, anything can be made into an idol. And it's one of those unfortunate things about human nature that we have this predilection towards idolatry. And everyone has this predilection. It isn't just, say, the ancient Israelites. You know, we're just as idolatrous today. That's just human nature. And we struggle constantly in our human nature against idolatry. So that's what's going on there. There is a connection between the Old Testament pericope and the Timna bronze serpent, but it goes back to Egypt. Thank you very much for your question. Fascinating question, and I'm glad I could take a non-super chat. Okay, I see a few more super chats here. Another one from Jonathan Billings. Okay. Could you elaborate as to why the 480 years in the Book of Kings is not evidence for a early Exodus, and how did the ancients do chronology and numbers? Okay. It boils down to the grammatical historical method. Now, for the last 300 plus years, the Christian church has used the grammatical historical method to interpret scripture. We have just always done this. We've done this ever since the fall of the allegorical method in the church. And the allegorical method was so flawed it wasn't even funny. We might get into that at some point, but the allegorical method is really messed up. A Catholic monk by the name of Dom Calmet came up with this method, and it was rapidly adopted by the Protestant church. The Protestant church universally accepted this. That basically said the way we interpret the scriptures is to first look at the genre, look at the grammar, look at the historical context, and then make our interpretation. So the first thing you always want to look at when interpreting a text is the genre. Now, the 480 years, it comes from 1 Kings 6:1, where it talks about in the 480th year, Solomon built his temple in the 4th regnal year of his reign. Okay. Now, what we have there in that one sentence is actually a genre. And it's a genre not unlike poetry or prophecy or apocalyptic or narrative. It's a special kind of genre called a temple dedication inscription. And we find these across the ancient Near East. There's one from Mesopotamia talking about the dedication of the temple of Elishama. We find one for the rededication of the temple of Baal at Avaris. We find these all over the place in the ancient Near East. And the formula of these temple dedication inscriptions is you mark an important event with a unspecified long period of time. Now, one of the things is that unspecified period of time has to be numerologically significant, but it does not have to be exact. In the other cases that we find across the ancient Near East, none of them are exact. We don't find a single temple dedication inscription that is exact down to the year. They're all numerological. Okay? So the context of that genre determines that the 480 years is not necessarily exact. And it doesn't even have to be close to accurate. Like for the temple dedication of Seti the First at Avaris, it's 400th year, 4th month, 4th day of a Hyksos king. Now we know that's not accurate because there were no Hyksos reigning 400 years prior to that inscription. You know, the inscription is off by more than 50 years. In the case of the Mesopotamian inscription of Ninurta the First, we have, again, it's not an accurate rendering of the dates, but what it is numerologically significant. What we find is the numbers 12 multiplied by 60. And what we have with that particular kind of numerology is 60 is used the same way in Mesopotamia that 40 is used in the Levant. They're important numbers culturally. In the case of Mesopotamia, 60 was what they based their number system on. They had sexagesimal mathematics. So they would count using a base 60 system. So for them, 60 was important. Well, in the Levant, 40 was important. 40 by 12 gets you 480. So what you have in here is a genre that takes an important event and then ties it to a numerological, a euphemism, more or less a euphemism. 40 being a euphemism for an indeterminate long period of time. And we see this use of 40 all over the ancient Near East. We see it in the Moabite Stele. We see it even in the Bible, you know, where it talks about, you know, David reigning his 40 years, but after the return of Absalom, he waits 40 years and then approaches David. Well, those can't both be 40 at the same time. Okay? So we have to realize that what we're dealing with here is a different way of using numbers than, say, in our modern, say, scientific, engineering, accounting worldview. They're dealing with their own worldview. The ancient Israelites had their own worldview. It was a worldview that was magical. It was a view that where gods and demons ran around the face of the earth. There was where symbolism and a metaphor and analogy were exceptionally important in this culture. You know, we can't use our own standards of science and engineering and accounting, you know, concepts that have been only developed in the last 500 years, and try to apply that to an ancient writing. It doesn't work. I mean, frankly, their definition of a year isn't even the same as ours. I mean, we're using a Gregorian year. You know, even if you just said Julian years, you know, the Israelites didn't even have intercalation, so their year was actually shorter than the Julian year. So again, we have to take these things on their own terms. So when the ancients do say chronology, we have to understand that they didn't do chronology. Chronology had not been invented yet. It wouldn't be invented for another, say, 1,000 years at least. They're doing things in their own way to symbolize what they've done. Now, in the case of numbers, again, sometimes it's an accurate account, sometimes it isn't. It depends on the context. Context always matters. And it also depends upon how the number is being used. So I hope that answers your question. If you have something specific, please feel free to ask it. I'm always eager to answer this question because I think it's one of the most misunderstood topics in the church today. But anyway, thank you very much for your question. Really appreciate the super chat. Okay. $5 super chat from 501 Mobius. Thank you very much. The super chat editor did allow the Dumafka spelling. I don't understand that super chat. Yeah, sorry, I just don't understand that super chat. Super chat editor did allow the Dumafka. Did not allow the Dumafka spelling? I don't understand. The what? Did allow it. Well, I sorry. I'm trying to understand this. I just don't. Oh, I see what you're getting. I see what you're driving at here. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. Yeah, the one classical Exodus. I'm going to actually post this one up because that's actually clearer. One classical Exodus theory relies on Serbit al-Qadam being the toponym for Dofka or the mountain of turquoise. What could Dofka mean other than that in Egyptian? I'd have to look at that in more detail. It wouldn't be dew because dew is not actually an Egyptian word. It could be ta. It would be mefkat. It would be ta mefkat. The dropping of the meme here would be problematic. It is possible that it could be Serbit al-Qadam. Possible. But again, the etymology of Serbit al-Qadam does indicate turquoise, and you would have that meme in there. I don't see the meme dropping out there as being that's problematic, but it's possible. It's possible, and that's what I'll give it is it's possible. It would definitely be on the route, I think, if you're going down the West Sinai from, say, Mara to say, possibly the Wadi Faran. But again, I can't elaborate more until I really sort of study this. So, but thank you very much for Super Chat, and thank you for the clarification. Because that at least gave me something that I could sort of hook on to, that I could say, okay, ta mefkat, or would be sort of the it wouldn't be pa, it wouldn't be and it would probably be the T pronoun here. So, but that would convert just fine to D. That's not a problem. Anyway, thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate it, and thank you for that clarification. That made the world of difference. Okay, another super chat from Jonathan Billings. Thank you very much for $4.99. What would you say is your favorite, most obvious piece of evidence for the historicity of the Exodus account? Last one, I promise. Oh no, don't make promises like that. Promises like that make me sad. Never promise to be the last super chat. Okay. My favorite piece of evidence for the historicity of the Exodus. I'm very big on toponyms. I think toponyms are excellent. I think toponyms are wonderful pieces of evidence. And why I think toponyms are such great pieces of evidence is it not just tells us about the antiquity of the Exodus, but it also tells us about the antiquity of the actual texts when the Exodus was written down. Toponyms are really unique, and toponym is just a fancy word for place name. It's if you ever do like a family genealogy, the first thing that the family genealogists always tell you is it's not just important to have the names of your ancestors, but also where they lived. And the reason why where they lived was so important is because it ties a place and a person to a specific context. And that is really, really important to establishing historicity, because places can also be dated. So when we have, say, the Exodus itinerary, we have all these place names. We have information about when these names came about. Like, for example, Pithom, also called Etham. It comes from the name Per Atum, House of Atum. That name was the capital city of the province of Cheku, the Wadi Tumalat, the nome of the arrow, the harpoon, sorry, nome of the harpoon. And the that name was given to the city Pithom Cheku when Ramses II built his temple of Atum. And at that point, the city became rechristened and renamed to Per Atum. So just by knowing the name Pithom, we know that that text had to be written sometime during or after the reign of Ramses II. We also know, because of the place name, that that city ceased to function, was abandoned around the Saite period. So in the first millennium BC. So we already, just by knowing that one piece of information about Pithom, just having that name, and the historical context around that name, we already have a window for the Exodus from the reign of Ramses II to, say, the 8th century BC, when it was abandoned. That gives us a good piece of information right there. Now, we can narrow it down with other evidences. Other toponyms help us narrow that window even further. But you can see how toponymic evidence can be really, really useful and really, really helpful. And it's my favorite evidence, because you could just, as I said, just dial things in with it. It's really interesting. You know, people don't get interested in place names, but it's really fascinating, especially when you're having to trace stuff down like this. So, thank you very much for your super chat. Please don't make it the last one. Okay, another super chat from King in the North for $5. Were the extremely old ages given in the Old Testament commonplace for other cultures in the time period? We do find this in the King's List of Mesopotamia, where you get these ages of, say, and they're weird ages, like 12,500 years and 28,000 year reigns, and then 60,000 year reigns. So we do see this in Mesopotamia. Now, when we talk, say, then about Mesopotamian, they're using it as sort of those sort of extended ages kicked in before Mesopotamia actually developed the concept of the year. Now, one of the things we have to realize, say, in, say, Mesopotamia is, and really every culture, not every culture had developed the concept of the year at the same time. Some cultures developed the concept of the year more quickly. Egypt developed the concept of a year before, say, Mesopotamia, which is really, really interesting because Mesopotamia is actually the older culture. But Egypt developed the year because it had an annual inundation cycle, an annual flood cycle, so the year was really, really obvious. So they marked the year by the inundation. Mesopotamia, because the rivers tended to be more steady and the climate had less seasonal swings, the concept of a year developed a lot later in Mesopotamia. With that said, the idea of old ages is something we do find in other cultures. We even find it to some extent, limited extent, in Egyptian cultures too. Like, for example, we find like the scribe was 110 years. A wise man was said to live 110. In the say some of the kings lists, you find, say, the gods living to 50,000, 25,000 years, that sort of thing. So we do see this in there. Now, I don't think the Old Testament is using extreme old ages in quite that way. What I think is happening in the Old Testament is something very, very different. I think what we're seeing in the Old Testament is the lifespan of, say, clans. So I think that's what we're seeing in the Old Testament is not so much the ages of individuals who are living to 900 years, but a clan that's living to 900 years. There's this concept in ancient Near Eastern thought that a person dies 3 times. Okay? There's the death of the body. There is the death of the memory. People who remember you die, and then you die a second time. And then finally, the death of your name. Your name is no longer spoken. Okay? And I think what we're seeing in, say, these extended ages is that we see clans living a long time and then being replaced by other clans, by new clans that rise up. And we see that sort of, say, the death of the name. So that's what I think is going on in these Old Testament texts, as opposed to, say, being one person who lives a very, very long time. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate that. Hey. Frodo Chat. Frodo Jack. Super chat for $5. What is your opinion of when and where of the Great Flood of Noah? Thank you very much for the super chat. I'm not going to comment too much on when and where of the Great Flood of Noah. At this point, I still hold to a universal flood. I'm still trying to determine exactly what that means and how we interpret that text. There are some interesting things about Noah's flood. It is very, very pregnant with the symbolism of ritual furniture. Yeah, I know I'm a ritual furniture guy. You know, shoot me for that, okay? It is what I did my PhD dissertation on, so I can't help but see furniture everywhere. But Noah's Ark was called a teba, which is actually a kind of chest that was used in ancient Egypt. It was a ritual chest. And the process that we see happening in the flood is a kind of sacralizing conversion. And what I mean by sacralizing conversion is that in temples, when somebody wanted to give an offering to a temple, you couldn't just take your temple and just plop it in front of the statue of the god and say, here's my holy figs. The reason you couldn't do that was because those figs were ritually defiled. Because the gods lived in holy space, and everything outside of the temple, figs included, was profane space. It was ritually tainted. So what would happen is you would bring your figs to this sort of window on the side of the temple. You'd give your figs to a priest, and a priest would take those figs, put them in a holy box, cover up the box, chant some rituals, take the box to the god, open up the box, and pull out holy figs. Now, they're the same figs as coming out of the box instead as they were going into the box. The only difference is now they've been sanctified by ritual and by this by magic spells. And part of that ritual includes using this box to convert the figs from unholy figs to holy figs. And that's what we mean when I say a sacralizing converter. Okay? Now, Noah's Ark is one big sacralizing converter. It's taken animals, 2x2s, pairs of sevens, or humanity, putting them all in a teba, which is a box, and then using the flood, as a means of purification, as a sacralizing converter, and out of the ark come animals and humanity sanctified for a new world. Okay? Unholy space of the old world to holy space of the new world. Of course, men completely messed this up again at Babel. But suffice it to say that that's my opinion of what's sort of going on with the whole flood narrative. With that said, I think if it did happen, and when it happened, it would have been long before the pyramids of Egypt. Long before. And I don't see any, say, chronological information in the Old Testament that really gives us some help here. So I don't think we have a good idea when it happened. I think it's impossible to say. The so-called chronologies of the Old Testament are actually very, very ambiguous, because the firstborn of that clan wasn't actually necessarily the firstborn. It was the preeminent one that's given that honorific position. So it's impossible to say when. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And we got another super chat from King in the North. Did the average Egyptian family have something they belonged to that was equivalent to a tribe or a clan? How important was family lineage to Egyptians? Yes. They did have they didn't have there were tribes in Egypt, and to some extent clans. We do see this in Egypt. And family lineage could be very, very important, especially if you were among the upper classes, because family lineage also meant property and inheritance rights too. The fact is, your typical family in Egypt didn't own a lot of property. Property was not a big deal, but inheriting titles were, and occasionally land deeds. There's one tomb, the tomb of Mes, and Mes has in his biography where he said that he had to look up the lineage of his ancestry to prove he was a descendant of one of the original soldiers of Ahmose I. Now, the big deal here was that Ahmose I gave land grants to all his soldiers. when the Hyksos reign was broken up, the Hyksos had a monopoly on land, thanks to Joseph. So we do have that sort of little indication in the text that Joseph's work to get that land monopoly actually lasted throughout the rest of the reign of the Hyksos. But at the reign of the Hyksos, Ahmose I conquers and then breaks up those holdings and gives each of his soldiers a inheritance, a piece of land. And we can also see that there's sort of a reminiscence here too between, say, the inheritance of the soldiers of Ahmose and the inheritance of the Israelites who have served the Lord. They're also given a land grant when they enter in the Promised Land. So there's a little side parallel there too. It's very interesting. So Mes has to go back through these tax records, and he's actually actually has to travel to Memphis, the administrative capital of Egypt, and go through these day rolls, these dozens and dozens and dozens of day rolls, tracking down his family lineage so he can connect his pedigree to Ahmose, because that gives him status and rank and the land grant. So yes, it can be very important sometimes in ancient Egypt. So while a lot of families, it didn't matter, like for farming, it didn't matter. But for some classes, it was very, very important. So thank you very much for that question. Very interesting question. And thank you for the super chat. Okay, JD Freeze, another super chat for $5. Thank you very much for the super chat. Did Egypt ever have the equivalent of a Sabbath day or day off during the week, or did slaves and others work every other day? Okay, interesting question. One of the things we need to understand is that Egypt had a different definition of the week than the Israelites did. The Egyptian week was 10 days long, and you got half day off. You worked 9.5 days. So there wasn't an equivalent of a Sabbath. It was really the Israelites that invented the 7-day week and the Sabbath. So this is something we can all, Christian and non-Christian, thank the Israelites for, is that day off, because it did not exist prior to Mount Sinai. So we see this, and it's really interesting because Egyptians didn't have this. They worked 9.5 days, and then next day they're back at the beginning of the work week again. So they did not have a concept of a Sabbath, and they only got half-day work, and it didn't matter what class you were. All classes had the same work week. Whether you were a priest, whether you were a soldier, whether you were a farmer, or whether you were a slave. Everyone worked the same work week. And same kind of drudgery. So thank you very much for your question. Great question. I love these cultural questions. They're very interesting. Okay, Carlo, $5 super chat. Thank you very much. What do you think the supposed parallels between the Covenant Code with Hammurabi's Code, as well as Deuteronomy and the Assyrian tablet, the treaties? Okay. There's actually a couple issues here. Okay. Now, there are parallels between Hammurabi's Code and, say, the Israelite laws. We actually see more parallels actually in Genesis with Hammurabi's Code than we do actually later on in Hammurabi, or sorry, in Deuteronomy. Okay, so there's actually a lot more parallels in, say, Abraham's interaction with his family and the other, say, sojourners in Canaan than we find in Deuteronomy. So that's very interesting right there, is that there is this interaction, and there does seems to be a very, very strong influence between Hammurabi's Code and, say, how Abraham sees the world. Okay, and there were many, many law codes at the time. Now, one of the things about these law codes is they're also highly structured. Kenneth Kitchen did a really, really excellent work on this called Treaties, Laws, and Covenants. And it is a ghastly expensive book. I mean, it's like 300 pounds, which is like $500 to US. Terribly, terribly expensive book. But it is also very, very excellent. And it talks, it has, if you want, say, a one-stop shop for all the law codes, I think it has all the law codes that have been discovered except for 2, I think, that were discovered after the publication, after winter publication. But it compares the structure of all these various law codes. And one of the things that Kitchen sort of discovered is that the law codes we find in, say, Exodus and Deuteronomy match more, say, the treaties that we find, say, in, say, Hittite treaties than, say, in later Assyrian treaties. So there are parallels between those ancient treaties and, say, the Torah. But though the comparisons, the basis of comparison, seems to be a better match for earlier treaties than, say, later treaties. So anyway, thank you very much for that super chat. I hope that answered your question, and thank you very much. Very much appreciate it. Whoa, Converse Contender, good to see you. Fantastic. Thank you for the super chat, and it's good to see you. Okay. Why was Egypt so different than Levant with shared history? Well, part of it's preservation. Part of it is the understanding of what is actually history. The fact with Egypt was it had this sort of cultural idea that the only good history is history that never changes. So if the whole predication of Western history is that change is history. You don't record nothingness. Change marks new things. So for Western history, we record the change of kingdoms, the change of kings, the change of philosophies. Everything in Western history is based around change. And to some extent, Levantine history is also based on, to some extent, on change. The idea in Egyptian history is that change is bad. Okay? So you don't find history being recorded in the same way. So what we look at when we talk about, say, the Egyptian context of history is that Egypt didn't really record history like we know it in the West, or even in the Levant. Egypt recorded history as being a cyclical process of sameness. And so, thus, when we actually try to look at Egyptian history, we would have to then go and actually glean it from religious texts, where offerings are made in the form of deeds that certain kings have done. So that's why there's a difference between, say, Egypt and, say, the Levant on their outlook on history. But thank you very much for the question. Very interesting question. And thank you for the super chat. Okay, here's another one. Marie Swee. Which version of Shem's genealogy in Genesis 11:10 do you think is correct? The Hebrew or the LXS with the 100 years added when they have children? I tend to more go with the Septuagint here. I think that the Septuagint is more accurate and it's more consistent, at least for Shem's the Genesis 11 genealogy. Now, it's been a while since I looked at this, so I made that determination some time ago. So I can't exactly point to you exactly why that is, but that was the determination I came to when I did the text critical work at the time. Now, I haven't looked at, say, the Genesis 5 genealogy, so I have no comment there. But one of the things we're sort of learning with the Dead Sea Scrolls, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first came out, something very interesting happened. It was thought when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered that this was going to solve that ultimate question of Masoretic text versus Septuagint. Well, what we found in the Dead Sea Scrolls was sometimes it confirms the Septuagint, sometimes it confirms the Masoretic text, sometimes it confirms neither, sometimes it confirms the Samaritan Pentateuch. We got results that were all across the board. So text critical work has to always be done on a text-by-text basis. And the reason I came to say more of a Septuagint reading was because it also is closer to the Samaritan Pentateuch reading. So when we have, say, do a piece of text critical work, you look at the Masoretic text, you look at the Septuagint, and you look at the the Samaritan Pentateuch, the Masoretic text, and the Septuagint, and then you determine which is, say, the most rational reading based upon the three texts, and then you add other texts like the Dead Sea Scrolls if they're extant for that particular text. So the majority of readings seem to have been best support the Septuagint in this case. So that's why I sort of gone at follow the Septuagint. So it's not that the readings make more sense, it's the text critical work seems to better support that reading. So so that, I hope that answers the question. Thank you very much for it. I think that's for 50 Swedish krona, if I got the currency correct. I'm starting to pay more attention to the currency markers ever since that the last live stream, and I didn't understand the Israeli shekel symbol, so I'm trying to get my currencies more correct. But thank you very much. Just a little side note, my grandmother was from Sweden, so thank you again for the super chat. Very much appreciated. Okay, another super chat from Frodojack for $5. Thank you very much. The Serpent was common to pre-dynastic Egypt and Serpent was common to pre-dynastic Egypt and Uruk. What do you think of Al-Ubayyad Sumerian influence on early Egypt? Okay. I don't know what a serpapard is. That will that's going to affect my answer here, unfortunately, because I don't know what that is exactly. That's not a term I'm familiar with. Perhaps if you specify what that means, I might be able to. Okay, a mythical animal known from. I'd have to look. Okay, my wife told me that it is a mythical animal from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. I would have to look into the iconography of that to really sort of give you a thorough answer there, and I haven't looked at that. Now, was there cultural interchange between Sumeria and early Egypt? Oh, almost inevitably, yes. Trade goods flowed all across the ancient Near East, going way back to pre-dynastic times. We know that at least. So there is actually some influence there. We don't know exactly what it is. As far as who invented writing first, again, that's sort of still an open debate that seems to sort of seesaw between Egypt and Sumeria. So it's hard to know exactly what the influence is, and pre-dynastic Egypt is not exactly my specialty, so that's probably the best answer I can give you on this. But thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate the question. Fascinating question, but I don't have an answer to it. Okay. We have a super chat here from Michael Beeson for $5. Thank you very much. Biblical Hebrew versus Coptic as first language for Christian studies with a third language Greek. This is in response to your language video. Okay. Um, Greek, if you're going to do biblical studies, you need to know Greek and Hebrew. That there's no question about that. Other cognate languages are also very, very helpful, like Aramaic, although you could probably go without Aramaic if you had to. There's actually very, very little, there's only a few passages in the Old Testament that are actually Aramaic. So you can actually get by without Aramaic. As far as Coptic, the problem with Coptic is if you want it taught well, you have to actually go through an entire course of training to actually... I actually recommend Coptic normally after you learn both Greek and late Egyptian. The problem is, in order to learn late Egyptian, you also have to learn Middle Egyptian. I think people who try to teach Coptic as an individual language without all those other languages struggle, and it ends up trying to be a hackneyed Greek course. And I've seen way too many people try to teach Coptic as hackneyed Greek, and it's not it's not hackneyed Greek. It's the last phase of the ancient Egyptian language. It actually has more in common with late Egyptian than Greek, even though it uses Greek characters plus 6 additional symbols. And 10% of the vocabulary is Greek. Most of it is Egyptian. If you learn Greek and then late Egyptian, Coptic is a breeze. Coptic is very easy like that. You just see so many familiar forms, it's just not even funny. But if you're trying to take Coptic without knowing Greek or any form of Egyptian, Coptic will be a struggle because it's just so unfamiliar otherwise. So in this case, I would recommend, if you're doing, say, biblical studies, Greek and then biblical Hebrew. If you want to do ancient Near Eastern studies, then I would say skip the Greek, go with biblical Hebrew, then Middle Egyptian, then add Greek. Okay? So it's all going to depend on what you're doing. So a little more context may have helped to refine that answer for you, but that's sort of the general guidelines here. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate that. Okay, another super chat from Jonathan Billings. Thank you very much, $4.99. To what extent do you think Moses is responsible for the authorship of the Torah, if any? I lied. Here's another question. Shocking. Well, I appreciate that you lied. I'm sure God will forgive you for the lie. Okay. I think Moses is very much responsible for the authorship of the Torah. Now, what I don't think he did was, I don't think he put his hand to pen it necessarily, or pen it all. He might have penned some of it by hand. He would have been capable of it. I think he had scribes to help. I think he did a lot of it by dictation. I think a lot of it was in, say, smaller sources. Say, certain chapters in Deuteronomy he would have penned, and then a scribe came along later on during the early monarchy and said, these are the words, and just added the words, these are the words said by Moses, or written by Moses. And you'll see this all through Deuteronomy, where these are the words written by Moses. And then it'll give you the list of almost the entire chapter of what Moses had said. So I think there is sort of a collection of texts aspect to the Torah. But I think most of the core stuff was written by Moses, or at least written under his direct mentorship, under his direct supervision. And as far as the ancient writers are concerned, that's the same as having written it himself. You know, and even sort of say the text at the end of the Torah where it talks about the death of Moses, you know, obviously Moses didn't write that himself. It's still inspired scripture. It's just, again, part of what You know, there might have been an instruction left to add the death of Moses, or this was a little text that they just tacked on to the end when they did the compilation of all the Mosaic sources. So I think the vast majority of the Pentateuch was written under the supervision of Moses. Exactly was by his hand? I don't think so. I don't think it was by his hand, and I think there is some sort of collection and gathering of his texts to create the Torah sometime around, say, the reign of King Saul. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very good super chat. Okay. Another question by 501 Mobius for $5. Thank you very much. There is a story that Abraham went to the land of Moriah, which was Jerusalem, and attempted to sacrifice Isaac. Any opinion where Moriah was? That's a debated question. There is the sort of the traditional answer that that it was on the Temple Mount. Okay. Now, I don't think it was on the Temple Mount. It might have been the Mount of Olives. That's a possibility too. I don't think it's all that important where exactly Mount Moriah was. And I actually don't have a firm opinion on this. Because I've never really looked into this question. But there is some, as I said, there's some tradition that it is the Temple Mount. I don't think it's the Temple Mount. Because I think it was that that Jerusalem was already, say, a Jebusite city by that point. So I don't think that was the case. But with that said, however, it could have been any one of the mountains. We just don't know which one. So I'm sure there's some tradition that'll answer that question, and I'm not that aware of what that tradition would be. And there may be other scholars that have more input into this than I would. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciate that. Okay, Converse Conventor, super chat for $2.99. Thank you very much. What is your view on who Melchizedek was? Okay. Wow, this is an interesting question, because actually we know a fair bit about him and his town. We just talked about this. It's Jerusalem. He was king of Salem. Salem was the old name of Jerusalem. Now, one of the things about Melchizedek is he's probably a Jebusite. Melchizedek is probably a Jebusite. Now, this is why I don't think Abraham tried to sacrifice Isaac on the Temple Mount. And that's because Melchizedek was king of Salem at the time, and Salem was Jerusalem. We find Jerusalem under the old name. The Jebusite old name for the city was Urushalem. All right? Or Urushalem. And this is Old Canaanite for city of Salem. And Salem was a Jebusite god. And we also see this theophoric name in Melchizedek as well. You know, Melchizedek. Zedek is king. Okay. So we do know a little bit of a small amount about Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the ruler of Salem. We do know it was an extant city at the time of Abraham. We find the city mentioned very briefly in the Amarna letters. He was a Jebusite. He wasn't a worshiper of Yahweh, but he was somehow seen as being a higher priest of some kind. And this is very, very interesting all by itself, that Abraham respected Melchizedek enough to tithe 1/10 of all he had to this king. And Melchizedek blesses Abraham. So there was some sort of indication here that even though there may have been some sort of leaning to some other gods and the worship at Salem, that there was this respect to the higher god and this higher priest. So that's my opinion of Melchizedek. Thank you very much for the super chat. Very interesting super chat. Okay, another super chat from Manuel Pichardo for $4.99. Thank you very much for the super chat. Does Joseph and Moses' ages have any Egyptian meaning or significance? God bless. Love the channel. Joseph's definitely has as meaning as an Egyptian significance. He lived to 110. That was the canonical age for a wise man in ancient Egypt. Okay, so there is canonical meaning there in Egyptian culture. No doubt about that for the age of Joseph. For Moses, Moses was said to have lived to 120. What we have here is not so much an Egyptian significance, but you do have a Levantine significance there, which is his life is divided into 3 groups of 40. Okay, 40 being the amount of indeterminate age, and then you take 110, you add 10 on, and you've got a superior wise sort of ruler age. Okay, so it's sort of a kind of a one-up on the 110. So Moses saved his, Joseph saved his people by bringing them to Egypt. Moses saved his people by bringing them out of Egypt. So his contribution is better than Joseph's. So that's what you're supposed to take away from the age of Moses here. And there's definitely some cause to say that, okay, Moses didn't actually live to 120, but that these are symbolic numbers that were meant to convey a certain religious significance. And I think that's really, really clear from the text that that's what's being done here. So thank you very much, and God bless you too. Thank you for the super chat. I'm glad you love the channel. Okay, that's the end of the super chats. Let's see if we can find now another question. Again, please mark your questions with the beginning of a Q. I'm going to scan here for a question. Already taken that one. Let's see here. Okay. I'm going to take this one, but I'm not going to probably answer it in the way you want me to. Okay? Is Asher's appearance in one of Seti the First's topographic lists valid evidence that Israel existed in Canaan before 1250 BC? There's some issue around the whole sort of interpretation of Asher and the whole Isharu thing. I'm not exactly sure which what exactly you're referring here. There's some people have suggested that Asher here is not actually a reference to the tribe. Like, for example, Robert Rittner has suggested that this is actually an allusion to Ashur or Assyria. And that's definitely possible in the case of it being Ashur. The difference between Asher and Ashur is just so slight that one could easily be the other. So there's ambiguity with that particular name, which has always been problematic. So I think that's very interesting. Now, guys like Manfred Gork have tried to suggest that Asher is just another name for Israel. And I don't think that works. I don't think that works etymologically. I think that's a kind of a bust. So I don't think this is good evidence for Israel existing in Canaan before 1250. I don't think that works. So again, it's the ambiguity of the name is just not sufficient here for making that conclusion. But I appreciate the question. It's a good question. Thank you very much for the question. Okay, and... I can't hear you. Answer who? Ahmed. Okay, my wife here has told me that there is a question by Mohammed. Let me see if I can find it. Mohammed. Okay, Muhammad Karam. Okay. Hey, Dr. Falk. What would the Egyptians call hieroglyphs? Did they actually view them to be divinely inspired? I'm going to answer the second one first, which is no, they did not consider hieroglyphs to be divinely inspired. Now, the view on hieroglyphs sort of changes over time. Early on in Egyptian history, they just called it writing. They just called this sesh. Okay, that's what they called the hieroglyphs, is just writing. And it would be no different than us using English today. Now, with that said, the Egyptians did have a phenomenological view of writing. So writing itself wasn't divine, but it was, say, inspired by the god Thoth. Thoth, in Egyptian myth, gave the Egyptians writing. Okay, that's the mythology there. Now, Egyptians also believed that they could change the structure of the world by writing something down. And one of my favorite examples of this is, say, the if I were to write on a piece of paper, may my nemesis trip at every set of stairs he climbs. Okay? For the Egyptian mind, this would change the mechanics of the world so that my nemesis would be tripping at the top of every stairs he climbs up. Because writing was an instrument of magic. And that instrument of magic had the power to change the world. And the mechanics of the world. So that was very, very instrumental behind, say, Egyptian thinking regarding writing. Now, later on, during the Hellenistic period, during the Ptolemies, the view of writing sort of changes. It changes from being just writing in general to being something, hieroglyphs as being something special, something priestly, something almost magical. And frankly, what they did to protect this writing too was also obfuscated. So if you ever read Ptolemaic hieroglyphs, they are full of extra characters that make no sense at all. It's Ptolemaic writing is really sort of a furball of writing. It's not pleasant to read. But what the Egyptians called it, they just called it sesh, as writing. That was the name of hieroglyphs, hieratic, any sort of writing that they did. You'll sometimes hear bandied around the term Megeneter, okay, the words of the gods. But that was really more along the lines of, say, magical spells and incantations. So the words of the gods were really more, say, incantations. So I hope that answered your question. Great question, and I thank my wife for pointing that out to me. All right, let's see what else we got here. And I do see your reply there, and I'll just highlight it. So Megeneter is total nonsense. Yes. I would have never said that, but since you're such a astute listener to my channel, I'll agree with you. Yes, it's total nonsense. Okay. And let's see what else we have. And we're taking more non-super chats than normal, and I think that's okay. This is cool. Let's see here. I've just taken that question. Let's see. I see another question. I do ask, though, that you don't repeat the question, so I actually can figure out what is what's a unique question, what isn't. So if you can I'm going to take this one. This one's an interesting question, too. By Justin Hall. Can you explain why Mount Sinai is sometimes called Horeb? Because places could have multiple names. We just find this in Israelite texts, and we actually find this in other texts too. We find this in Ugaritic texts. We even find this sometimes in Egyptian texts too. Like, for example, there's 4 different names for the city of Memphis. It's just one of those things that we find in ancient texts that, you know, something can have multiple names. A place can have multiple names. And this is one of the sort of the challenges of ancient geography. If you ever do any sort of serious study in ancient geography, you'll find that places can have multiple names. And not only that, multiple cities can have the same name. And this is really aggravating. Like, for example, there are 2 places that are called the Yam Suf, the Sea of Reeds. You know, there's the one that's on the northwest of the Sinai that the Israelites crossed. And then there's another one, say, at the sort of the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba, you know, and you know, there's this idea that both places were called a Yam Suf, a Sea of Reeds. We find 21 cities in the ancient Near East called Antioch. We find 3 cities in Egypt called Hermopolis. This is just one of the challenges you have to deal with when doing ancient geography. So it is not unusual also to have cities with the same name, or sorry, with 2 different names referring to the same city. You know, I think it was Bethel and Luz is another one, or and you find this happening all over the place in the ancient Near East. So it's actually fairly common. This phenomenon actually happens fairly frequently. Not exactly sure why, other than, say, you know, the tradition of the time that led up to that. But again, that's a big challenge of ancient geography. It's a great question, though. Thank you very much for the question. Really appreciate that. I love good questions. Okay, this is an interesting one. Question. Was a commander of thousands, 50s, 20s, etc. a thing in the ancient Near East? Russell Gmerkin seems to think it's specifically a Greek thing. Wow. Gmerkin is so far out in left field that you can't get a radar fix on him. When Tommy Thompson says you've gone too far, maybe you've gone too far. And I think this is what we have with Gmerkin, is he sees everything through a Greek, Neoplatonic, Hellenistic lens and just applies everything to it, and it's resulted in a ridiculous piece of scholarship. I mean, it's just, this is really a fringe view, and I don't say that lightly, but because he is the only guy holding this view, I can say it's a fringe view, because he's an outlier here. Now, as far as thousands, 50s, and 10s, we do know that the Egyptians did break up their armies according to companies and divisions and that sort of thing, because we have various ranks of commanders. Okay, so this goes into military titles, and say, you know, we got in ancient Egyptian, you got a variety of military titles, and they do seem to break down in accordance to smaller units. So I don't think this is something that's, say, unique to Greek times. If you're, say, moving a large amount of people like you would in the Exodus, you would have to organize them in such a way such as you don't leave anyone behind. So I think this is just natural division sort of playing out here. I don't think this is specifically a Greek thing. I think American is straining the gnat here to grind an axe. So I don't have a lot of confidence in his work. But thank you for the question. Very interesting question. Okay, we're going to take one last question here and call it a day. see here. I'm not going to take that one. Not right now, anyway. And that one would be... There is a question here about the parallels between creation account in Genesis and ancient Near Eastern and Egyptian myths. I'm not going to take that because that's would be a really long answer. You'd have to be... I'm just going to flash it out there. You're going to have to be really more specific about that because that's almost a whole course all by itself. A big question. It's actually too big to answer on a channel like this because there's a lot of them. I do want to answer one more question if I can find one here. That's good. All right, I'll take this one here. And this will be the last question of the night. Maskovsky, does the fact that ancient Jews didn't know about genetics and evolution would change your view on the validity of claims like God is creator and organizer of everything on material existence? No, it wouldn't. No, it wouldn't change my view one bit. And that's because the fact is that the ancient Jews are asking different questions. You know, they're not asking questions about genetics or, you know, evolution or things like that. That's not even on their radar. They're, as I said earlier in this live stream, you know, they're not a scientific engineering accounting culture. We are. We ask those questions. Those questions are important to us. And they're really not even asking questions like, you know, what is, say, the origin of life? You know, they're not even asking that question. That question is not even, you know, again, on their radar. They're asking questions more along the lines of cosmogony. You know, what is the relation of Yahweh to other gods? That's the question that's most important to them. So when you look at, say, Genesis 1 and 2, they're asking questions like, you know, how does God relate to all these other ancient myths that are out there, such as Enuma Elish, or the hatching of Ra? You know, so that's what their concern is how do they relate their beliefs to this smorgasbord of different creator myths. So that's what they're dealing with. You know, the slaying of Tiamat and the death of Tiamat that by Marduk that creates the land and the sea. How does their god relate to that myth? How does their god relate to, say, the Memphite theology where Ptah speaks and it comes into existence? You know, in some cases they're going to find, say, parody. Yes, the God of Genesis 1 is powerful enough to speak, and it comes into existence, just like the Memphite, like Ptah. You know, in some cases they're going to say, no, it's not like Marduk slaying Tiamat at all, because it's there is no the primordial dragon that just exists that God has to challenge. There's no challenge at all. You know, God's bigger than that. God's bigger than the sun, bigger than the moon, bigger than all these things. So they're asking questions of theogony, they're asking things about cosmogony, they're asking all these other questions that we aren't even thinking to answer, because we're not living in that context. So, I don't think it challenges their validity at all, as you know, is God the creator and organizer of everything in material existence? Because the fact is that the sort of the brass tacks of how that happens isn't a concern to them. It's just as I said, it's not on their radar. Even though it's our radar, and I think we do say the text a disservice when we try to apply those modern sort of questions to a text that's really not trying to answer them. It asks its own questions and it's demanding its own answers. So that was a very interesting question. Thank you very much for that question. And that will be the last question of the day. Thank you very much for joining us on this super chat. Great set of questions again. Very, very much want to thank all the people who did a super chat. Oh, Manuel, one more super chat, really? As I'm closing? Okay, a quick, really quick one. Thank you for that super chat for $4.99. Are you aware of any other synchronisms with older patriarchs such as Enoch and the seventh from the Babylonian king list? Yes, I am, and you're going to have to wait till I do my video coming up on Abraham's father, Terah. Okay, I am aware of a synchronism. This is a brand new synchronism. Not going to answer it here. I'm actually doing a video on this, and it'll be coming out soon. All right. So thank you very much for the super chat. Very much appreciated. And with that, I'm going to call it a night. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much for my super chat, and to my Patreon supporters and the people who have helped me with GoFundMe. And if you like this content that you've seen on these live streams, please hit that subscribe button. It really helps. Thank you, and good night.